Hello students, regional associations are extremely important in international politics. Among these regional associations are ASEAN, SAARC, OIC, OPEC, etc. Today we are going to talk about ASEAN. ASEAN is a very important organization, particularly in Southeast Asia and East Asia. What does ASEAN stands for? ASEAN stands for Association of South East Asian Nations. ASEAN was formed on 8 August 1967. Currently, there are 10 members under the ASEAN group. The 10 members are the following: Myanmar, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, Philippines, Laos, Cambodia and Vietnam. Together these 10 countries, they constitute about 3% of the world's territory. These 10 countries also constitute about 8.8% of the world's population, which comes to around 600 million people. ASEAN also is the 9th largest economy in the world today as per the 2010 estimate, which comes to around $1.8 trillion. So, as you can see, ASEAN plays a very important role in international politics, in social, economic, political and also in a cultural context. Now, let us talk about the aims of ASEAN. Why was ASEAN formed? First of all, it was for the economic development. The economic development under the ASEAN was not on a progressive on a uniform basis. It was different in Myanmar, different in Singapore, different in Philippines and different in Laos and Cambodia. But all these 10 countries, they decided to have a more or less a uniform economic development agenda, so that all these regions can also progress forward and so that their GDP and per capita income can also progress. Secondly, the social development, the social condition of these 10 countries were also very different, because they started with different history, with different backgrounds, from Myanmar to Indonesia to different countries. They had got some colonial backgrounds as well. So, they all wanted to move up in the social ladder. In the process, they found ASEAN to be a very useful forum to make significant improvement in the world today. Third one is the cultural development. In these countries, you can see lot of indigenous groups in all those countries, from Philippines to Laos to Cambodia. All of these indigenous groups, the minority groups, they also wanted their visibility to be improved. That is why one of the aims of ASEAN is to make sure that the indigenous people's lives are also significantly improved. Among the principles of ASEAN are the following: number 1, non-interference in the internal affairs of each other's country. So, all these 10 countries, they have decided not to interfere in the internal affairs of any country. Second, each of these countries, they put lot of emphasis on sovereignty and national integrity of each of those countries, because territorial integrity is extremely significant, because most of these countries, they are also geographically contiguous, and it is possible that there might be some disagreements in terms of country A to country B to country C. So, they have decided that there should be a full respect for the sovereignty of each other's country, for the territorial integrity of other countries. Also, in terms of the principle of ASEAN, there is an emphasis on the non-use of force or intimidation. So, all those 10 countries, they put an emphasis on not using any force in terms of deciding any bilateral issues or even multilateral issues. Third, in terms of the principles, they always adopt the policy of pacific settlement of disputes. In terms of any territorial disputes, they have decided that they are going to discuss in a spirit of conciliation, in a spirit of dialogue, so that those things can be resolved without the use of force, without intimidation, without resorting to violence. In fact, one of the founding importance of ASEAN is there has never been any war in between those 10 countries, because they have always put their principles up front. Another important principle is not only within themselves, but also in the larger and wider international arena, they respect all international rules, regulations and norms, particularly the United Nations. All of these countries are important member states of the United Nations, and in that capacity they take part in all the socio-economic developmental aspects of ASEAN. Now, let us talk about the background of ASEAN. The background of ASEAN, if you look back into the Cold War years, we started after 1945, it is one of colonialism, because most of these countries, let us take for example Indonesia. Indonesia was under the Dutch colonial rule until 1947. Myanmar was under the British. Singapore was also under the British. Philippines for a long time was under the Spanish, and also later on it was also under the Americans. Indochina, Laos, Cambodia and Vietnam, for a long time there was the war which was fought by America, and also there has been war in Korea nearby in Northeast Asia. So, there has been a tragedy of the history of the Cold War period which has been hunting these particular Asian countries. Also in terms of the economic development, there has been very uneven development among these countries. So, these countries they wanted that without the help of external powers, whether it is China, whether it is Great Britain or Spain, the colonial masters, or even the United States of America, it is possible to form an association which can look at the interest of these particular people, looking at their own national interest and also at the same time making an improvement. In terms of the strength of ASEAN, there are a couple of them. Number one, it stresses a lot of emphasis on multi-civilizational aspect. What is multi-civilization? Because if you look at different countries, for example, Indonesia, it is basically an Islamic country. The most populous Islamic country in the world is Indonesia. Look at Singapore. The majority ethnic group in Singapore is the Malayas, followed by Chinese and Indians. Look at Laos and Cambodia, etc. Most of the people are Buddhist in origin. So, it celebrates cultural diversity, ethnic diversity within a multi-civilizational model, and they bring a lot of confluence within that particular one. In terms of the strength also, it puts emphasis on flexibility, because with a flexible approach you can resolve lot of things among the countries within intra ASEAN group or even within ASEAN group and some other groups also, for example. So, this flexibility is very, very important. The third element is the level of trust, because unless you have a trust among nations, you cannot progress too far. So, I think there has been an element of trust among these countries, so that all these countries in certain matters they have decided on social, economic, political and all other aspects to move forward. While saying so, I think it is also important to know some of the shortcomings and weaknesses of ASEAN. What are those shortcomings and what are those weaknesses? First of all, it eludes consensus, and consensus is very important thing. What happens is each country goes after their own national interest. They want to protect and promote their national interest, which is fine, but if you stress the national interest to a greater margin, then what happens is it avoids or it eludes the national consensus, or it avoids the consensus, and I think that is very, very important for a success of an organization. Secondly, because of the lack of consensus, that leads to a slow decision making process. You can hear a lot of meetings that takes place in ASEAN among the heads of state, among foreign ministers, among finance ministers, but at the end of the day sometimes the decision making process is extremely slow, and that impedes lot of socio-economic development. Also in terms of the weaknesses, lot of times the external powers, whether it is United States of America or China or Japan or Australia or even some other countries, they try to influence the decision making process, and sometimes that affects the organization as a whole, because different organizations they try to curry favor with different countries with different purpose and different agenda. Having said that, I think let us also now look back at some of the important actors in ASEAN. For example, the US factor. Why US is very important? As we all know, the United States of America is not only an Atlantic power, because if you look at it from the USA, from the Atlantic coast, from a European context, but if you look at US from the Pacific coast, US also claims to be a very important Pacific power. It has got important stakes in Asia. As we all know, in the post Cold War era, which started out in 1990, it is the United States of America which is the sole superpower, and in that respect it considers it has a predominant say, or maybe you can use the word hegemonic influence in Southeast Asia, particularly in ASEAN countries. It has got bilateral trade with almost all countries in the world. It has got defense agreements with many countries, whether it is Thailand, whether it is Philippines, whether it is Korea, or even in Japan or in Australia and New Zealand. So, United States feels for its own national interest and to expand its own sphere of influence and to maintain its own dominance and hegemony, it is extremely important to cultivate good relations with not only each and individual countries of ASEAN, but also with ASEAN organization as a whole. That is why you have been seeing in the last couple of years the trade volume between ASEAN and US, take any example, Laos, US, Cambodia, US, even Vietnam, United States, it has gone many-fold. Let us now talk about the China factor. China, as you know, is now the most populous country in the whole world and second most powerful country in terms of economy, even outpacing Japan last couple of months ago. China has a stake in ASEAN and also in Southeast Asia, because China feels it is the supreme power in ASEAN, in Asia, which is the largest continent in the world, and it also competes and jockeys with the United States of America for a bipolar world, meaning United States and China in the post Cold War, particularly in the new millennium in the 21st century. So, China wants to carve a niche for itself to also maintain its own turf, and not only to do that, but also to expand it, particularly in the post Mao era, in the Deng Xiaoping era, and in the current Hu Jintao's regime of China. They have tried to develop and expand their trade relations, their commerce relations, their import and export with all of these countries. Now, if you look at the trade volume between Singapore and China, between Vietnam and China, between Indonesia and China, this is at an all time high, because this is a win-win proposition for both these countries. And these countries, they cannot ignore China, because that is the most important power in the contemporary period, and also it is so close by, and it also plays a very important role not only in geopolitics and also in geoeconomics, because the world politics plays in both ways, geopolitics and geoeconomics. Geopolitics means the combination and culmination of geography and politics. The geoeconomics is geography and economics, and lot of times it goes simultaneously, it goes side by side. After China factor, we can also talk about the Japan factor. As we know, ASEAN in recent times, they have gone for two important manifestations. One is ASEAN plus 1 and one is ASEAN plus 3. Now, let us first talk about what is ASEAN plus 3. ASEAN plus 3 means the original group of 10 ASEAN countries plus 3 other countries in the own periphery in that particular neighborhood, namely China, South Korea and Japan. These 3 countries are part of ASEAN plus 3. As part of that, they have got regular meetings at the heads of state levels. They meet at different places in among those countries, sometimes in Vietnam, sometimes in China, sometimes in Korea, for their own bilateral agenda to expand the trade, to expand the volume of commerce, and in all different aspects. Sometimes they also discuss about politics, sometimes they discuss different aspects about the global issues like global warming, like climate change, etc. So, ASEAN plus 3, that is a very important development in the last couple of years. Similarly, ASEAN plus 1 is also very, very important. What is ASEAN plus 1? That means the 10 ASEAN countries plus 1, which is India. You can also always ask why it is not clubbed like ASEAN plus 4. The reason is there is still a lot of misgivings among some countries, particularly China. They do not want India to sit along with the ASEAN group in the same room or in the same chamber. That is why ASEAN, when it deals with India, it always is called ASEAN plus 1. If you look back at India's foreign policy, in 1990 and 91, we have a new Prime Minister called P.V. Narasimha Rao, and he embarked the policy of economic liberalization, and that is the time when we talk about privatization and also globalization at the international levels. So, in India in 1991, when P.V. Narasimha Rao was the Prime Minister and Dr. Manmohan Singh was the Finance Minister, we embarked economic liberalization. At the same time, we also started and heralded a new aspect of India's foreign policy known as India's Look East policy. What is Look East? Primarily India's foreign policy was Look West, meaning West Asia, the oil rich countries, the Gulf countries, the superpowers, namely Soviet Union, later on after the post Cold War era, Russia, United States of America, Great Britain, France, Africa, Latin America, etc. But in 1991, Rao and Manmohan Singh, they looked into a newer turf, which was East Asia, which is beyond Bangladesh, which is how India can develop and cultivate good relations with Thailand, for example, with Singapore, with Malaysia, with Indonesia, with Vietnam. That is why you have been seeing in the last few years India's Prime Minister and the Prime Ministers of those countries, they are also making reciprocal visits. The whole idea is to develop a new form of relationship, particularly taking to a new paradigm shift. Sometimes we hear about the new agreements. For example, India has signed trade agreement called CEPA, CEPA, Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement with Thailand, with Korea, with Japan, with Vietnam, with many other countries, because India has a lot of commonalities in terms of culture and societal aspects. So, India feels it is a natural partner to have good relationship with Singapore, with different countries from the historical past. That is why this ASEAN +1 is very, very important, and India's economy is also growing up, India's GDP is also growing up, India is also the second most populous country in the whole world. So, having India on its side, and India is also very important next to China in terms of the overarching influence in this particular aspect. So, India factor is also very, very important. All those countries, they take a lot of importance in India. India has also got a lot of ethnic influence in different countries. For example, if you go to Singapore today, the president of Singapore, he is of Indian origin. Foreign minister of Singapore, the education minister of Singapore, they are all of Indian origin, because there is a sizable Indian ethnic background people, particularly from South India. They live in places like Malaysia, in Singapore, in Fiji and some other countries. Now, let us talk about the Japan factor. Japan is also very, very important in ASEAN scene, because Japan does not like to be marginalized, Japan does not like to be peripheralized, Japan wants to have its own voice in the ASEAN bloc. There are areas in which it agrees with China, there are also areas in which Japan wants to maintain its own dominance in terms of trade and commerce, in terms of the technologies that it has got in some of the high tech industries. That is why you will see a lot of influence of Japan also in different ASEAN countries. And at the same time, they also want to extend and expand their own national interest in that particular region. There are also some other countries in the periphery, for example, the Koreas. When we talk Koreas, we talk about both South Korea and North Korea. South Korea is an important military ally of United States of America, but we are also going to talk about North Korea. North Korea, as you know, they have also developed nuclear weapons. That particular regime is sometimes they create some problems for the international community, but some people feel that the interest will be best served by making it more inclusive, by trying to engage them rather than trying to exclude that particular Kim Jong-il regime in North Korea. So, North Korea and the Korean peninsula, that is kind of unstable area in East Asia and Northeast Asia, which is on the periphery of ASEAN. So, that is why when you talk about ASEAN, you not only have to talk about individual countries, how they make progress, but you also have to take about the larger neighborhood that it resides. For example, in East Asia, in Northeast Asia, because a lot of times this overlapping kind of things that happens. Also, we can talk about the defense relationship among the ASEAN countries, and also in terms of the external relations. In 2005, when the tsunami struck, one of the spin-off effect of the tsunami was called the tsunami diplomacy. The tsunami diplomacy stood for the countries that were affected by the tsunami, for example, India, for example, Indonesia, Singapore, Australia. They tried to develop a network in terms of not only to prevent disaster management, but also how to prepare and how to strengthen their defense mechanisms. Sometimes they do it solo using their own indigenous resources, but sometimes they also take the help of some other countries. For example, India, every year they have a Malabar exercise which deals with the defense collaboration with some of these ASEAN countries for a win-win proposition. There are issues, for example, like piracy, which is very important in Arabian Sea, in Bay of Bengal, in Indian Ocean, in Malacca Strait, and lot of the trade volume that goes through two ASEAN countries back and forth, it is done through Malacca Strait, and there is a lot of instances of piracy. And in this context, let me add that India plays a very important role, particularly India's Coast Guard and India's Navy, in interdict the pirates, so that the trade flow from the Gulf countries through Arabian Sea, through Indian Ocean, through Bay of Bengal to the Malacca Strait to Sea of Japan, etc., goes uninterrupted. So, that way there is a complete flow of energy security to all of these countries. Some of those countries, for example, Japan, they are completely energy dependent. Some of the countries like Laos and Cambodia, etc., they are also dependent on oil and natural gas, etc. So, this is very, very important that there has to be a commonality of approach among these countries, because there are certain issues which are transnational in character. Piracy is one important issue which I just outlined. Another important issue is terrorism. Terrorism was always an important issue, but in the 9/11 episode after September 11, 2001, terrorism has also occupied a center stage, particularly in terms of international terrorism. We are talking about domestic terrorism, international terrorism, narco terrorism, cyber terrorism, etc., etc. In Southeast Asia, these terrorist incidents are very indigenous also. In Philippines, for a long time there has been these terrorist incidents going on in the Mindanao province. Indonesia, the Abu Sayyaf group, they have been very active doing a lot of terrorist activities. In Bali incidents, in Indonesia also there has been incidents of terrorist incidents. So, all of these countries, they have joined hands together to stop the menace of terrorism, and in this respect I think if you look at their credentials in terms of counter terrorism and in terms of their cooperation with other international bodies, I think you have to really admire these particular countries. We can also talk about some other issues like drug trafficking, in terms of human trafficking, in terms of climate change and global warming, etc. So, I think in all of these global commons, these ASEAN countries, they have important stakes, because all of them, they are important stakeholders. They may not be of the same shapes and sizes. Obviously, Malaysia, Indonesia, they are much bigger in size than comparable to Laos and Cambodia, but even small states, they have got important state, because all of them are important members of ASEAN. They are also equal members of ASEAN, and ASEAN also prides in the fact that each member have got the same vote, whether in different aspects, etc., etc. Let us talk about some of the future challenges. For example, the pandemics issue, the ASEAN currency crisis of 1997, in terms of the different wars, etc., etc. Sometimes it might happen, because sometimes the ethnic issues might split into one part. Also, the issue of Myanmar is very significant. Myanmar, as you know, is also an important member of ASEAN, but there are a lot of countries in the area, they feel that Myanmar might cause a problem, because Myanmar is believed to be developing nuclear weapons, is also getting clandestine support from China, and also in Myanmar they do not have a democratic regime. It is ruled by military regime, which has held the Nobel laureate Sung Wee for a long time under detention. So, I think there are issues to be resolved in Myanmar, not only in terms of the drug trafficking, etc., but in terms of the democracy deficit, and also in terms of the nuclear ambitions. There has been also a movement in ASEAN couple of years ago to make the ASEAN zone or the Southeast Asian zone as a nuclear zone of peace or free of nuclear weapons, but it is easier said than done, because lot of the countries, they do it not overtly, rather covertly, meaning secretly. For example, North Korea, it does not proclaim openly that it is a nuclear country, but it has believed to have developed some nuclear weapons. Same thing with Myanmar regimes. It is believed they are also trying to develop nuclear weapons. So, if Myanmar is going to be overtly nuclear and North Korea is already nuclear, I think that is going to create a very cataclysmic situation in a very violent cyclic way, because some other countries, they might also be tempted to develop nuclear weapons. Tomorrow Japan might go nuclear, tomorrow Philippines might go nuclear. Some of these countries, of course, they get support as a nuclear umbrella from the United States, from some other countries, but it is also possible because of the national interest, and which is a very volatile term, because national interest, what is today may not be same 5 years from now, 10 years from now, it can change, and accordingly the priorities and perceptions of different countries might change. But having said that, I think if you look at ASEAN in a broad perspective, in spite of the fact that there are weaknesses in ASEAN, but I think they are also making important strides in today's world, because in a globalized world you cannot just be self dependent, because each country depends on some other countries on different ways, in different means. It is an interdependent world, meaning each country depends on some other countries in some aspect. Even a big country like United States of America, they depend on for oil with Saudi Arabia, with countries in West Asia, or even with a small country like Brunei in ASEAN, because Brunei has a lot of natural gas. And also they need support in the diplomatic levels also in the United Nations, and also the specialized agencies of the United Nations. So, I think in this globalized world and in this era of globalization, it is very important. Some of the important issues that we deal with, whether it is global warming, whether it is pandemics, whether it is climate change, whether it is WTO negotiations, etc., it is better to discuss among each countries bilaterally and also multilaterally, to have more increased access among those countries, so that those things can be discussed, put it on the tables in a spirit of dialogue and discussions. It is not possible that everybody agrees with everything, but having a discussions in a very open discourse, I think at least one person or one country should understand the other side very, very clearly about particular ways. Also, I think in terms of the ASEAN geographical boundary, we should also think about the larger picture of Asia Pacific scene, because lot of times we always look at a more micro or a macro aspect, but we also have to have a bigger magnified perspective, because Asia Pacific is also very important in terms of economy, in terms of the military components, in terms of the expanding role of Asia Pacific, and you have to include countries even like Australia, New Zealand, etc., which are also playing very important role. They also contribute positively. Lot of times what we see is the issues of like illegal migration, etc. It affects one country more than the other countries. That is why what they do is there is a ministerial council in ASEAN, they discuss about the illegal migration, how to stop trafficking, etc., how to stop counterfeiting of currencies, etc. Because if a one particular regime is being destabilized, it is obviously having a affect some other countries. So, that is why it was very important that all of these countries they join hands together. It is almost like sometimes we say that like the domino theory in the 1950s and 60s, if one country falls to communism, it is likely that some other countries might fall to communism, and that happened in the 50s and 60s, and we saw that in Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam for a long time, the American interference, etc., etc. I think the ASEAN countries they learnt a great lesson from that, they learned a good lesson from that one. That is why they want to avoid the great power intervention in that particular part of the world. They would like to resolve things among themselves. If the United States of America or China, for example, they would like to help ASEAN either individually or organizationally, they are most welcome to do so, but they have to be like facilitator, not like a hegemonic power, not like a dominant power, not like to take over ASEAN just like America is a dominant power in North Atlantic Alliance or some other countries. I think it is possible each of these countries they know how far they can go in terms of extending their national interest, but at the same time they know that they cannot ignore the influence of China, they cannot ignore the influence of United States of America or even India. In this respect, I think India also plays very important role. I think in the future you will see more active collaboration among these countries like among ASEAN +3, which is China, South Korea and Japan, and also ASEAN +1 with India. In fact, as far as India is concerned, India is also being requested by some countries to be a full-fledged member of ASEAN and also a part of the Shanghai Cooperation Council. So, I hope the students have learned a great deal from today's lecture, which is on ASEAN, the entire aspect, the strength, the weaknesses, the backgrounds, the aims, the principles, the long term prognosis of ASEAN. In the next segment, we are going to talk about another important organization, a regional association which is also playing a very important role, which has also got a lot of strength and also some weaknesses, which is called SAARC, South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation, which is primarily consisting of 7 countries in South Asian region. So, that is for the next class. Thank you very much.